Welcome back to another chilling episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. Today, we dive into one of California's most disturbing criminal partnerships, the Speed Freak Killers. For 15 years, childhood friends Wesley Shermantine and Loren Herzog terrorized the Central Valley, turning their hunting skills from animals to humans. With a shared addiction to methamphetamine fueling their violence, they may have claimed up to 70 victims, many of whom still remain missing today. From abandoned wells to remote wilderness, their hunting grounds became burial grounds. This is the story of how two small-town boys became one of California's most notorious killing teams, and how their secrets continue to emerge from the depths decades later. In the vast expanse of California's Central Valley, beneath the seemingly peaceful agricultural landscape, a terrifying series of murders would unfold throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The perpetrators would come to be known as the Speed Freak Killers, and their reign of terror would leave an indelible mark on the communities of San Joaquin County and beyond. Wesley Shermantine and Loren Herzog grew up as childhood friends in the rural town of Linden, California. Their early years were marked by hunting trips and outdoor adventures, activities that would later take on a much darker significance. Both came from working-class families, and by their teenage years, they had developed a dangerous addiction to methamphetamine, which would fuel their increasingly violent behavior. The transformation from childhood friends to serial killers began gradually. In the mid-1980s, young women started disappearing from the area. At first, these disappearances seemed unconnected, just another tragic statistic in California's missing persons cases. But as the years went by, a pattern began to emerge, though it would take law enforcement many years to piece it together. One of their first known victims was Chevy Wheeler, a 16-year-old girl who vanished from Franklin High School in Stockton on October 7, 1985. Shermantine had convinced her to skip school, promising to take her on a date. She was never seen alive again. Her disappearance devastated her family, who would spend decades searching for answers. The killing spree continued with calculated precision. The duo's method typically involved approaching young women, offering them rides or drugs, and then taking them to remote locations in the vast rural areas surrounding San Joaquin County. What made their crimes particularly horrific was their hunting mentality. They treated their victims as prey, often using their extensive knowledge of the terrain to dispose of bodies where they thought they would never be found. In 1994, they claimed another victim, Cindy Van der Heijden, a 25-year-old woman who was last seen at a bar in Linden. Cindy knew both Shermantine and Herzog, which wasn't unusual in their small community. On the night of her disappearance, witnesses reported seeing her leaving the bar with the two men. This would be the last time anyone saw her alive. The killers' methodology became more refined over time, but their increasing methamphetamine use made them sloppier. They began leaving more evidence, taking greater risks. Their victims weren't just random selections. They often knew them from the local area, which would eventually contribute to their downfall. Throughout the 1990s, law enforcement had suspicions about Shermantine and Herzog, but building a case proved difficult. The remote locations they chose for their crimes, combined with their careful disposal of evidence, made it challenging to connect them definitively to the disappearances. However, their reputation in the community was well known. Local residents spoke in whispers about the pair, particularly about Shermantine's volatile temper and Herzog's compliant nature. The breakthrough came in 1999, when investigations into Cindy Van der Heijden's disappearance finally gained traction. Physical evidence began to mount, and witnesses started coming forward. The partnership between Shermantine and Herzog began to show cracks under the pressure of increased police scrutiny. What made this case particularly chilling was the killers' intimate knowledge of their hunting grounds. They used the sprawling landscapes of San Joaquin County, the abandoned mines, the deep wells, the remote wilderness areas, as their personal burial grounds. They knew exactly where to hide their victims, choosing locations that would make recovery nearly impossible without specific directions. The magnitude of their crimes became apparent during the investigation. Law enforcement began to realize that the missing persons cases they had been dealing with over the years might all be connected to these two men. The victims weren't just numbers. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and their disappearances had left gaping holes in countless families' lives. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Shermantine and Herzog had developed a system for their murders. They would often use methamphetamine before and during their crimes, which they later claimed affected their memory of specific details. This drug use would later become a crucial element in their court proceedings, as Herzog would claim it impaired his ability to recall events accurately. The partnership between the two killers was complex. Shermantine was typically the dominant force, while Herzog often played a more submissive role. This dynamic would later become critical during their separate trials, as each would attempt to blame the other for the worst of their crimes. By late 1999, law enforcement had gathered enough evidence to make their move. The arrests of Shermantine and Herzog sent shockwaves through the community. People who had known them their entire lives struggled to reconcile the image of the local boys they grew up with the monsters they had become. The investigation revealed that their killing spree might have claimed far more victims than initially suspected. While they were eventually charged with specific murders, authorities believed the true number of victims could be significantly higher. Some estimates suggested they might be responsible for as many as 72 deaths, though the exact number remains unknown to this day. As the case moved toward trial, the community held its breath. The speed freak killers had terrorized their region for over a decade, and now they would finally face justice. But the legal proceedings would prove to be just the beginning of a long and complicated journey toward understanding the full scope of their crimes. The trials of Wesley Shermantine and Loren Herzog began in 2001, marking the beginning of a complex legal saga that would span decades. The proceedings were held separately, a decision that would prove crucial as each man attempted to minimize his own culpability by pointing fingers at the other. Shermantine's trial came first. The prosecution presented a strong case, including DNA evidence linking him to several victims and damning testimony from witnesses who had seen him with the victims before their disappearances. Throughout the proceedings, Shermantine maintained his innocence, often displaying a disturbing lack of remorse that deeply unsettled jurors and courtroom observers alike. The testimony during Shermantine's trial was particularly haunting. One witness recounted how Shermantine had bragged about hunting the ultimate kill, human prey. Others spoke about his volatile temperament and his penchant for violence, especially when under the influence of methamphetamine. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculated killer who used his hunting skills and intimate knowledge of the terrain to carry out his crimes. In 2001, the jury found Wesley Shermantine guilty of 4 murders, those of Chevelle Wheeler, Cindy Vanderheiden, Paul Cavanaugh, and Howard King. The latter 2 were drug dealers who had been shot to death in 1984, representing some of the killer's earliest known victims. Shermantine was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison's death row. Loren Herzog's trial followed, but took a dramatically different turn. While he was initially convicted of 3 murders and sentenced to 78 years to life in prison, his conviction was later overturned on appeal in 2004. The appellate court ruled that Herzog's confession had been coerced by investigators who had questioned him for multiple hours without proper breaks or access to an attorney. In a controversial plea deal, Herzog pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter in the death of Cindy Vanderheiden, accessory to murder in 3 other cases, and furnishing methamphetamine. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison, with credit for time served. This outcome outraged the victims' families and the community at large, who believed Herzog was equally culpable for the murders. The years following the trials brought little closure to the victims' families. The bodies of many of the suspected victims remained unfound, including those of Chevelle Wheeler and Cindy van der Heijden. Shermantine, from his cell on death row, began a series of manipulative games with authorities and the media, occasionally hinting at the locations of bodies, but refusing to provide concrete information without receiving something in return. In 2010, Herzog was paroled after serving 11 years of his 14-year sentence. His release was met with public outrage, and he was forced to live in a trailer on the grounds of High Desert State Prison in Susanville due to public safety concerns. The years of imprisonment had taken their toll on Herzog, who struggled to adapt to life outside prison walls. The most significant breakthrough in the case came in 2012, when Shermantine finally began revealing the locations of some of his victims' bodies. This cooperation was prompted by a deal brokered by bounty hunter Leonard Padilla, who offered to pay Shermantine money in exchange for information about the burial sites. While some criticized the ethics of paying a convicted killer, the arrangement led to crucial discoveries. Shermantine provided hand-drawn maps from his death row cell, directing authorities to specific locations in San Joaquin County. In February 2012, following these directions, investigators discovered the remains of Cindy van der Heijden and Chevelle Wheeler. Van der Heijden's remains were found in a remote area near San Andreas, while Wheeler's were recovered from a site in Calaveras County, ending decades of uncertainty for their families. The discovery of these remains had an unexpected impact on Loren Herzog. On January 16, 2012, hours after learning that Shermantine was revealing the locations of victims' bodies, Herzog committed suicide by hanging himself in his trailer at High Desert State Prison. He left a phone message for his wife, apologizing for his actions, but maintaining that Shermantine had committed the worst of the crimes. Herzog's suicide added another layer of complexity to the case. Some saw it as a final act of cowardice, denying the victims' families the chance to confront him about other possible victims. Others interpreted it as an admission of guilt, unable to face the consequences of his actions being fully revealed. The search for victims continued throughout 2012, with investigators focusing on multiple sites identified by Shermantine. In an area known as Loren's Boneyard near Linden, California, authorities discovered more than 1,000 bone fragments. These remains were found in an abandoned well, suggesting that the killers had used it as a disposal site for multiple victims. The process of identifying these remains proved to be a monumental task. Forensic anthropologists and DNA experts worked tirelessly to match the recovered bones with missing persons cases from the 1980s and 1990s. Some of the remains were so degraded that identification was impossible, leaving many families still wondering about the fate of their loved ones. The discovery of the well near Linden opened up new avenues of investigation, but also presented significant challenges. The excavation process was painstaking, with investigators having to carefully sift through decades of accumulated soil and debris. Each bone fragment had to be carefully documented, photographed, and preserved for analysis. The well itself was over 50 feet deep, requiring specialized equipment and safety measures for the recovery teams. By 2013, DNA testing had identified several victims from the well, including Kimberly Billy, who had disappeared in 1984 at the age of 19, and Joanne Hobson, who vanished in 1985 at age 16. These identifications confirmed what many had long suspected, that Shermantine and Herzog's victim count was far higher than initially believed. The investigation took another turn when Shermantine began writing letters from death row, offering tantalizing details about additional burial sites. In one particularly detailed letter, he described a location he called Herzog's graveyard, claiming it contained the remains of up to 10 victims. However, his information often came with conditions. He wanted money, privileges, or transfers to different facilities in exchange for information. Law enforcement faced a moral dilemma. While they wanted to recover as many victims as possible to provide closure to families, they were hesitant to appear to be rewarding Shermantine for his crimes. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Shermantine would be temporarily transferred from San Quentin to assist in the search efforts, under heavy security. The searches continued throughout 2013 and 2014, with investigators following up on Shermantine's leads. Some searches proved fruitful, while others led nowhere. The terrain itself posed significant challenges. Many of the sites were in remote areas that had changed significantly over the decades due to development or natural erosion. One of the most disturbing aspects that emerged during this period was the realization of how the killers had used their local knowledge to their advantage. They had selected disposal sites that were not only remote, but also subject to natural forces that would help conceal their crimes. Many of the wells they used were in areas where the water table would rise and fall seasonally, helping to destroy evidence. In 2014, forensic investigators made another breakthrough when they identified remains belonging to Michaela Gerecht, a 9-year-old girl who had disappeared from Hayward in 1988. This discovery was particularly significant as it expanded the known geographic range of the killer's activities, suggesting they had traveled much further than previously thought to commit their crimes. The investigation also revealed more about the killer's methodology through recovered evidence and witness statements. They often targeted vulnerable individuals, young women who were alone, runaways, or involved in the drug scene. They would gain their victims' trust through casual conversation or offers of drugs, using their status as locals to appear non-threatening. By 2015, the total number of confirmed victims had risen to 19, though investigators believed the true count was much higher. Some estimates suggested that Shermantine and Herzog might have killed someone every 2 weeks during their most active periods in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The case also highlighted the devastating impact of methamphetamine on rural communities. Both killers had been heavy users of the drug, which they claimed affected their memory of events. The drug use had also made them more volatile and violent, reducing whatever inhibitions might have otherwise prevented their crimes. The ongoing investigation has had a lasting impact on law enforcement procedures in California. The case led to changes in how missing persons cases are handled, particularly in rural areas. There's now greater emphasis on looking for patterns across jurisdictions and better communication between different law enforcement agencies. For the families of the victims, the recovery efforts brought mixed emotions. While some finally received answers about their loved ones' fates, others continue to wait. The knowledge that there might be more victims whose remains may never be found weighs heavily on both investigators and families. The legacy of the speed freak killers continues to affect the Central Valley community. Many residents who lived through that era still speak of how it changed their sense of security and their trust in others. The case serves as a dark reminder of how well killers can hide in plain sight, particularly in close-knit rural communities where people are naturally inclined to trust their neighbors. The investigation into the speed freak killers has also led to significant changes in how cold cases are approached in California. The success in using new DNA technology to identify victims from the well near Linden encouraged other jurisdictions to revisit their own unsolved cases with fresh eyes and modern forensic techniques. In 2016, investigators began employing ground-penetrating radar technology at several locations Shermantine had mentioned in his letters. This advanced technology allowed them to search for disturbed soil patterns and potential burial sites without the need for extensive excavation. While not all searches yielded results, the technology helped identify several promising locations for future investigation. The psychological impact on the investigators who worked the case has been profound. Many have spoken about the emotional toll of recovering remains from the wells, particularly those of younger victims. Detective Deborah Scheffel, who worked on the case for over a decade, later revealed in interviews how the case had changed her perspective on evil. "These weren't just random acts," she explained. "They were calculated, planned, and executed with a level of precision that still haunts me." From his cell on death row, Shermantine continues to play a complex game with authorities. In 2017, he provided information about additional potential burial sites, but his information has become increasingly unreliable. Some investigators believe he's deliberately withholding information to maintain some level of control, while others think the decades of drug use have genuinely affected his memory of events. The case has also shed light on the particular vulnerabilities of rural communities to serial killers. The vast open spaces, isolated roads, and tight-knit social networks that make rural life appealing can also provide cover for predators. In the wake of the Speed Freak Killers case, many rural California communities implemented new safety programs and education initiatives. In 2018, forensic anthropologists completed a comprehensive review of all the remains recovered from the various sites. Using advanced DNA testing and archaeological techniques, they were able to separate and catalog over 1,500 bone fragments. This painstaking work led to the identification of 3 more victims, though many fragments remain unidentified. The case has also become a crucial study in criminal psychology. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychology expert who studied the case, noted how the partnership between Shermantine and Herzog represented a unique dynamic in serial killer pairs. "Unlike many killer partnerships where there's a clear dominant and submissive partner," she explained, "these two seem to feed off each other's worst impulses, creating a perfect storm of violence. The environmental impact of their crimes continues to affect the region. Several wells used as disposal sites had to be permanently sealed due to contamination concerns. The cost of cleaning and securing these sites has run into millions of dollars, with local communities still dealing with the financial aftermath. By 2019, advances in genealogical DNA testing opened new possibilities for identifying victims. Similar to the techniques used to catch the Golden State Killer, investigators began using genetic genealogy to try to match unidentified remains with family members who had submitted DNA to various databases. The case has also influenced popular culture, with several books and documentaries exploring the crimes. However, many local residents have expressed frustration with how these works sometimes sensationalize the events while overlooking the human cost. The victims' families have been particularly vocal about the need to remember their loved ones as people, not just statistics or true crime fodder. In 2020, a new task force was formed to specifically investigate cold cases that might be connected to Shermantine and Herzog. This team, combining veteran investigators with new forensic experts, began reviewing missing persons cases from the 1980s and 1990s that fit the killer's pattern but were never officially linked to them. The impact on the town of Linden itself has been lasting. Once known primarily for its agricultural community, it now carries the weight of its connection to these crimes. However, residents have worked hard to reclaim their community's identity, establishing memorial gardens and support groups for families affected by violence. Recent developments have included the use of new soil analysis techniques that can detect trace evidence of human remains even decades after burial. These methods are being applied to several locations where Shermantine claimed to have disposed of victims, though the process is slow and expensive. The case continues to evolve, with new technologies and investigative techniques offering hope for more answers. However, for many families, time is running out. Some parents of missing persons potentially connected to the case have passed away without ever knowing what happened to their children. Others continue their tireless search for answers, hoping that each new development might finally bring them closure. The ongoing impact of the Speed Freak Killers case extends far beyond the immediate investigation. In recent years, the case has become a catalyst for significant changes in how missing persons cases are handled throughout California's Central Valley. Law enforcement agencies have implemented new protocols for sharing information across jurisdictions, recognizing that killers often cross county lines to avoid detection. The lasting psychological effects on the surviving family members continue to be studied by mental health professionals. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a trauma specialist who worked with several victims' families, noted the unique challenges faced by those who never received definitive answers. The ambiguous loss these families experience is particularly devastating, she explained. Without remains to bury or a clear understanding of what happened, the grieving process becomes complicated and prolonged. In 2021, investigators began using advanced sonar equipment to examine several wells that had previously been inaccessible. This technology allowed them to create detailed 3D maps of the well structures, identifying potential areas where remains might still be hidden. While these efforts haven't yet yielded new discoveries, they demonstrate law enforcement's ongoing commitment to resolving every possible case. The role of methamphetamine in the killer's crimes has also prompted renewed discussion about drug enforcement in rural areas. Both Shermantine and Herzog's heavy meth use was seen as a crucial factor in escalating their violence. Local drug prevention programs now often cite the case when discussing the connection between methamphetamine and violent crime. Wesley Shermantine remains on death row at San Quentin, though California's moratorium on executions means he's likely to die of natural causes. He continues to occasionally provide information about possible victim locations, though investigators now approach his claims with considerable skepticism. His letters to various officials and media outlets often contain contradictory information, leading many to believe he's more interested in maintaining attention than providing genuine assistance. The true number of victims may never be known. Conservative estimates place the count at around 20 confirmed victims, but some investigators believe the actual number could be 3 or 4 times higher. The transient nature of some victims, combined with the killer's method of disposal and the passage of time, makes a final count nearly impossible to determine. Perhaps the most important legacy of this case is its influence on modern investigative techniques. The challenges faced in recovering and identifying remains from the wells have led to innovations in forensic archaeology and anthropology. These improved methods are now being applied to other cold cases across the country. The Speed Freak Killers case serves as a stark reminder of how violent predators can operate undetected in rural communities for years. It demonstrates the importance of taking missing persons reports seriously, regardless of the victim's background or circumstances. Most importantly, it shows how the passage of time doesn't diminish the need for justice or the pain of those left behind. For the communities of San Joaquin County, the case remains an open wound that may never fully heal. Yet from this tragedy has emerged a stronger, more vigilant community determined to prevent such crimes from happening again. The victims are remembered not just as casualties of 2 brutal killers, but as catalysts for change in how we approach the investigation of serial crimes and the protection of vulnerable individuals in rural America.